A quiet kind of heartbreak lingers in places where no one looks twice. They saw only the scars, not the fire she walked through to earn them. In a dusty roadside diner tucked between old gas stations and faded memories, she poured coffee with hands steadier than most men in combat. To them, she was just the quiet girl with the burned arm and tired eyes. But 12 years ago, beneath gunfire and smoke, she shielded a wounded Marine with her own body, whispering, "You're gonna be okay," as shrapnel tore through the earth around them. He never saw her face. Until today. When he stepped into that same diner, and time folded in on itself, and he realized the woman they mocked was the one who saved his life. Some people fade into the background by choice. Others do it to survive. Emily Carter arrived at Mel's diner before the sun had the strength to rise. Her silhouette moved through the steam and sizzle of early morning bacon like a shadow that belonged there, familiar, quiet, almost invisible. She wore the same white shirt sleeves always down, and a name tag polished not out of pride but habit. No one knew where she lived. No one asked. But everyone knew her coffee was always hot, her smile rare but real, and she never forgot your order, not even once. Some said she'd been through a fire. Others whispered about a car accident. But the truth stayed locked in the way she walked, steady, measured, like someone who once had to move quickly under fire and now values the calm in every ordinary step. She didn't have much, but everything she had she kept in perfect order, like a soldier who still salutes the day. Emily lived 2 blocks from the diner in a room no bigger than the kitchen she worked in. Peeling wallpaper, a leaky faucet, but clean. Always clean. Her closet held 2 uniforms, a coat for winter, and a box under the bed. Inside the box, a faded photo, a folded flag, and a medal she never spoke of. She didn't have a car, rode a bike with a squeaky wheel, didn't own a computer, didn't need one. She ate simple meals, instant coffee at home, no sugar, and at night she would sit by the window watching the streetlights flicker like they were remembering something too. People thought she was strange, but Emily wasn't strange. She was just tired. Tired, but not bitter, and still trying quietly because that's who she'd always been. Some wounds ache quietly. Others echo in the laughter of strangers. They came in every Thursday morning. 4 men in mud-stained boots and neon vests, loud laughing heavy with the kind of energy that didn't notice silence. They sat by the window, filled the space with crude jokes, and ordered with the confidence of men who'd never been told to hush. Emily approached like she always did, not smiling, but not cold either. "Well, if it isn't the phantom of the diner," one of them muttered, eyeing her sleeves the way she kept them low even in July. "Hey, what happened to your arm?" another snorted. "Fall into a bonfire or just lose a fight with a toaster?" The table erupted in laughter. Emily didn't flinch. She only poured coffee steadily like nothing had been said. But a flicker crossed her face. Not anger, not pain, just something quietly cracking deeper than words could reach. Sometimes cruelty isn't loud. It's in the quiet way everyone looks away. A couple at the corner booth lowered their eyes to their pancakes. A trucker at the counter stirred his coffee like it held answers he didn't want to say out loud. No one laughed, but no one spoke. The joke from the table still hung in the air, sharp, sour, and heavy. And still, Emily didn't stop. She handed out menus, refilled water, even picked up a fork that one of them dropped and muttered, "Don't touch my stuff with those hands." Her hands didn't tremble, but her jaw set tighter. Not because she was afraid, but because this wasn't new. She had faced rockets. She had worked with blood in her eyes. This was just Thursday. And even so, some wounds still reopened with the sound of laughter. Truth has a way of finding its voice sometimes in the smallest one in the room. From the next booth over, a small boy sat swinging his legs, a half-eaten pancake on his plate and syrup on his fingers. He had been watching Emily curiously, not cruelly. As she passed by, he tugged at his mom's sleeve, then looked up at Emily with those wide, unfiltered eyes children have. "Did it hurt?" he asked, pointing gently at the edge of her scar just visible where her sleeve had slipped. The diner went still again. Not in shame this time, but in something older, deeper, like grief pressed between napkins. Emily stopped, looked at the boy, and smiled, not out of politeness, but with something close to tenderness. Not as much, she said softly, as being forgotten. Some people walk into a room, others bring the past with them. The bell above the door chimed soft and ordinary, but something in the air shifted. He stepped inside wearing dusty jeans, a faded Marine Corps cap, and the kind of stillness that only men who've seen too much can carry. David Mitchell had driven across 5 states with no real destination, just a map full of memories and towns he'd never stopped in during his years of service. The diner smelled like home coffee bacon, warm toast. But it wasn't the scent that made him pause. It was her. The way she moved silent, exact like someone trained to know where her body was at all times. She wasn't smiling. She didn't need to. He'd seen that posture before. Not here, not now, in Iraq, in smoke and sirens. And something inside him whispered, "You know her." Sometimes memory doesn't shout. It whispers through a sleeve, a gesture, a silence. She approached his table like she did every other, steady, quiet, no frills. "Coffee?" she asked. He nodded. "Please." Black. As she reached to pour, the cuff of her sleeve slipped just enough. A faded edge of ink. Numbers. Letters. David's eyes caught them for only a second, but his breath hitched like he'd been punched in the chest. And just like that, he was no longer in a diner, he was back in Ramadi. March 2009. Route, Michigan. IED fire, screaming radios. Blood pooling faster than orders could be given. And a voice cutting through the noise. "You're gonna be okay. 3rd to 5th INF." His hand froze mid-reach. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did and had learned to pretend she didn't. The coffee filled his cup, and with it came a rush of sand blood and 12 years of questions. He looked up at her face, calm, distant, unknowingly familiar. He didn't say a word, but somewhere deep in his memory, a voice returned. "You're gonna be okay." There are movements so precise they stay etched in your memory long after faces fade. David sat motionless. Hands wrapped around the coffee cup, though the warmth didn't quite reach his fingers. Across the room, Emily moved between tables, not rushed, not slow, just exact. The way she stepped aside, instinctively avoiding a spill before it happened. The way her eyes scanned each table once, twice, like clearing a perimeter. He'd seen that before. In triage tents lit by red dust and adrenaline. Where seconds mattered. Where people moved like chess pieces under fire. She handed a plate to a toddler with 2 hands steady, careful, then adjusted the child's spoon without saying a word. It wasn't kindness. It was training. And in that moment something clicked, not in his brain, but in his gut. She didn't just serve coffee. She once saved lives. Some words don't just bruise. They echo, especially when no one stops them. "Hey, Frankenstein!" Chad's voice rang out from the corner table, loud enough to pop the diner's calm like a balloon. Emily was walking past with a pot of fresh coffee. "Think you can manage to serve that without spilling it on us?" Laughter. Not from everyone, just from the ones who always laughed. David's eyes snapped toward the noise. He watched as Emily didn't slow, didn't turn. She simply refilled their cups like it was routine. Because it was. "What happened to your face anyway?" One asked. "House fire, bad choices. Or did someone do it to you on purpose?" David felt something tighten in his chest. Not shock, not confusion, recognition. He'd seen wounds like hers before. He'd seen people carry them with silence. But this wasn't silence. This was survival. And suddenly watching her work felt less like nostalgia, and more like a call to remember. Sometimes the loudest thing in a room is the silence of people who look away. David scanned the room. The couple near the window pretended to stir sugar into empty cups. The trucker, who'd just chuckled, now buried his face in his newspaper. No one made eye contact. The men at Chad's table kept joking, loud and careless. But the rest of the diner, they disappeared into themselves, like they always had. And Emily she didn't flinch. She poured coffee, cleared plates, moved on. But David could see it now, the slight tightening of her mouth, the flicker in her eyes there and gone. He remembered something his captain once said in Iraq. Some people carry the war longer than it lasts. He looked back at Emily and realized she hadn't stopped serving. She had just changed uniforms. There's always one line, one sentence, one moment that turns silence into fire. "My eggs are cold," Chad barked, waving his fork like a king waiting to be served. Maybe if you moved faster instead of limping around like some broken-down wind-up doll, our food would still be hot. A few people chuckled. Most just looked down. Emily didn't flinch. She simply reached for his plate. "I'll ask the cook to make you a fresh one," she said quietly. "Don't touch it," another worker cut in. "God knows what kind of crap lives on that skin. I'm not trying to catch whatever she's got." The diner went still. Even the clinking stopped. David looked around again. He saw shame written on faces, but still no one moved. And Emily, she just stood there, plate in hand, expression unreadable. But David could feel it now, the same way he felt incoming fire before anyone else heard it. Something inside her had cracked. When the world goes quiet, it's often a child who says what everyone else is afraid to ask. At the booth behind the contractors, a small boy had been watching. Not with judgment, not with fear, just curiosity. He looked no older than 5 legs too short to touch the floor. As Emily passed by, coffee pot still in hand, the boy tilted his head and asked gently, sincerely, "Did it hurt?" The diner froze again. Not out of cruelty this time, but from the way truth had just slipped in through a child's voice. Emily turned to him slowly. Her eyes, tired and quiet, softened at the edges. She knelt slightly, looked him in the eye, and said with a voice lower than before, but somehow louder than ever, not as much as being forgotten. No one laughed. And David. He stopped breathing. Sometimes it's not the face we remember. It's the voice that stayed with us when everything else disappeared. David's world shrank to one sound. That voice, calm, low, certain. He had heard it once 12 years ago, over the ringing in his ears as a blood poured from his chest and chaos swallowed everything. "You're gonna be okay." He hadn't known who said it then, just that someone was there. Hands pressed against his wound, heart steady in a place where hearts weren't meant to survive. And now it was that same voice saying something even heavier. Not as much as being forgotten. He looked at her fully now. Not at the scars, not at the uniform of a waitress, but at the soldier beneath it. And in that moment, David Mitchell finally remembered what survival sounded like, and who had given it to him. Sometimes, to thank someone, you have to walk through the years that stood between you. David stood up slowly. Not with urgency, but with the quiet weight of someone carrying more than just memory. Emily was wiping a table, her back to him, moving with the same grace he'd seen on bloodied ground long ago. He crossed the room, not sure what to say, only knowing he had to say something. "Excuse me," he said. Voice steady but low. She turned, cautious, guarded, as if expecting another complaint. But when she saw his eyes, something in her paused. There was no threat there. Only recognition she hadn't wanted to face. "May I ask you something?" David continued. She nodded slowly, and in that brief silence, every scar between them began to feel shared. You can run from medals. You can hide your past. But some questions carry the weight of everything you thought you buried. David's eyes flicked down just enough to catch the faded ink beneath her sleeve. "That tattoo," he said gently. "3rd to 5th Infantry." Her hand instinctively pulled the cuff down too late. He didn't press, but his voice softened in a way only fellow soldiers recognize. "You served." Emily hesitated. A breath, a beat, 1,000 memories crashing through her ribs. 2 tours, she replied. Quiet, steady, like it still hurt to say out loud. Medic. David's throat tightened. Ramadi. Emily's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in a slow unfolding of fear and knowing. 2009. Root, Michigan. And that was it. The moment neither of them could take back. The moment anonymity shattered and truth finally stepped into the light. Sometimes the person who saved your life doesn't look like a hero, until you realize you're still breathing because of them. David's voice caught in his throat not from doubt but from the sudden weight of clarity. "Ramadi," he whispered, "IED on Route Michigan. I was hit, trapped, bleeding out. Emily didn't move, didn't blink. You were the one," his voice cracked. "You pulled me out of the Humvee. You kept pressure on my chest for 40 minutes until the medevac came." Around them, forks stopped clinking. The low hum of chatter faded. Even the men at Chad's table turned, sensing something had shifted. David looked at her not with pity, but reverence. "You saved my life." Emily met his gaze, and for the first time in years didn't look away. Sometimes it only takes one voice to make a room remember its conscience. The silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent. One by one, heads turned. Eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between strangers who had for years pretended she wasn't there. The couple by the window, the same ones who always looked away, now stood. The old man removed his cap. "Thank you for your service." "Sergeant," the woman said, her voice trembling like her hands. Emily didn't respond. Couldn't. Her walls, built from years of being unseen, didn't know what to do with sudden recognition. Even the men at Chad's table had gone quiet. For the first time, the scars weren't the most visible thing about her. It was her strength. And the room. It finally saw the woman behind the silence. Respect doesn't always come from a grand speech. Sometimes it walks out of a kitchen apron, still on, eyes wide with guilt. The door behind the counter creaked open. Frank Dawson, Emily's manager, emerged, wiping his hands on his apron, eyes red around the edges. He'd heard every word, and somehow they hurt more than he expected. "Ma'am," he said, his voice more formal than anyone had ever heard from him. I need to say something." The room stayed quiet. He stepped forward slow and unsure, but with a kind of resolve that only comes when shame becomes too heavy to carry. "You've worked here for 3 years, showed up early, stayed late, never once complained." He swallowed. "And I stood by, while people disrespected you." A long breath. "I want you to take the rest of your shift off, with full pay." He turned to the room. "And anyone who speaks to her like that again can take their breakfast somewhere else." A pause. "She's earned more than just tips here. She's earned our respect. The louder you've laughed, the harder silence hits when the truth walks in." Chad shifted in his seat. His earlier grin was long gone. Now he looked like a boy in a man's body, caught in a moment he didn't understand until it was far too late. He cleared his throat, eyes low. "Ma'am," he said, barely audible. Emily turned not with anger, but with the same calm she'd shown through every insult. That somehow made it harder. "We didn't know," he mumbled, "about all that, what you did." David took a slow step forward, not aggressive, just present. Chad glanced at him, then back at Emily. "If we had known you were a veteran..." Emily raised her hand just slightly, not to silence him, but to ask the only question that mattered now. Would it have mattered? And that one sentence landed like a stone in the center of the room, because deep down everyone already knew the answer. The hardest questions aren't the ones that accuse. They're the ones that simply ask, "Why didn't you see me sooner?" Chad didn't respond. He didn't have to. Emily's voice stayed soft, but it carried farther than any yell could have. Should it take a uniform, she asked, to earn basic human decency? The words hung in the air like smoke from a long-forgotten fire. A few patrons lowered their heads. Others stared at her truly for the first time, not as the woman with scars, but as the question they'd been too afraid to ask themselves. How many others had they looked past, judged, left behind in silence because it was easier than showing kindness without condition? David stood quietly beside her now, not to protect her, to witness her. And in that moment, the diner wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a mirror. Guilt doesn't always shout. Sometimes it rises quietly from the place where decency had been sleeping. The silence lingered. Not empty now, but full of eyes finally lifting breaths held a little too long. The trucker at the counter folded his newspaper, laid it flat. "We should have said something," he muttered more to himself than to anyone else. The old man by the window nodded, hands wringing his cap like an apology. His wife wiped a tear and whispered, "We saw it. We just didn't want to get involved." No one looked at Emily directly. Not yet. They were looking inward. At all the times they sat in comfort while someone else stood in quiet pain and they did nothing. And, for the first time, silence didn't hide them anymore. It exposed them. Some truths are too heavy to speak alone. That's when someone else says them for the right reasons. Emily stood in the center of the room still. She hadn't moved since asking her question, and she wasn't going to, because for her being seen was already overwhelming enough. David stepped beside her. Not in front, beside. "You don't owe anyone an explanation," he said, his voice steady, respectful. "You've already given enough." He didn't say it loudly, but it didn't need volume. It needed weight, and he carried it for her. Around the room, something softened. Not because they suddenly saw a hero, but because they realized they'd been blind to one all along. Not all silence means strength. Sometimes it's just someone trying not to break. Emily didn't look up. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried. "I just wanted to be left alone." The words didn't sound bitter. They sounded tired. "I didn't want attention. I didn't want pity. I just wanted to do my job. Pour coffee, go home, not have to explain myself to strangers every day." Her hands were still, but her shoulders just barely trembled. "I didn't need anyone to thank me." She added, eyes focused on a smudge on the floor, as if that was easier than seeing faces. "I just didn't want to be mocked for surviving." And, in that moment, she wasn't Sergeant Carter. She was just Emily, and that, finally, was enough. Some people live in the quiet not because they're afraid to speak, but because no one ever listened the right way. David didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it settle like dust after a storm. Then, softly, just for her, he said, "Maybe now you can be seen for who you've always been." Emily's eyes flicked toward him, uncertain. Not a uniform, not a waitress, not a scar. He nodded more to himself than to her. "Just you." Around the room, something changed. Not loud, but real. The kind of shift that doesn't shout but stays. And, for the first time since the bell over the diner door had rung that morning, Emily didn't feel like she had to disappear when it did. Sometimes the biggest change starts with a simple nod from someone who finally understands what they missed. The diner stayed quiet. But it wasn't the old silence, the kind that ignored. It was a new kind. One filled with eyes that wanted to say something but hadn't yet found the words. Then slowly, they did. The elderly man near the window who once turned away stood. He took off his cap not because it was polite, but because it meant something this time. "We didn't know," he said, voice rough. "But now we do." His wife nodded, eyes glassy. "Thank you, Sergeant," she whispered. A young woman near the jukebox added quietly, "You deserve more than tips." One by one, the quiet became presence, and the presence became respect. Earned, not demanded. Offered, not owed. The hardest step isn't kneeling in shame. It's standing in front of the person you hurt and not looking away. Chad stood slowly. No smirk, no swagger, just a man who suddenly felt small in the boots he used to stomp with. He walked toward Emily, each step like dragging weight he never realized he'd carried. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough, "I want to apologize." She looked at him, calm, unreadable. "What we said, what we did." He paused. "There's no excuse. We were wrong. I was wrong." He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." Emily didn't soften. She didn't harden either. She simply nodded. Apology accepted. Then, after a pause, "But remember this feeling. Next time you're tempted to judge someone by the piece of their story you can see." Sometimes telling the truth isn't about pride. It's about making sure silence never wins again. David took a quiet step forward. Not because he wanted attention, but because the room needed to hear what she would never say herself. He turned, facing everyone. The booths, the counter, the stairs frozen in realization. This woman, he began, didn't just serve in Iraq. A breath. She was one of the most decorated medics in our unit. Emily shifted slightly, but David's voice stayed steady. March 3rd, 2009. Ramadi. Our convoy was hit. I was bleeding out. He glanced at her, then back at the room. She shielded me from the second blast with her own body, worked on me under enemy fire for 40 minutes until the evac came. A hush. I made it home. 12 others did too because of her. Eyes welled, forks stayed down. She earned a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and more than that, she earned our respect the day most of us would have run. He turned to her again, voice soft now. You didn't want this moment, but maybe it's time it finally found you. Emily blinked once slow, like trying to stop tears before they gathered. She looked away, but not to hide, just to steady herself. And in that silence, the walls she'd carried for years didn't fall. They softened. Not all silences are equal. Some are heavy with shame, others with awe. The room didn't clap. No one cheered, because something sacred had just been spoken, and reverence doesn't need applause. A fork trembled in someone's hand. A glass of orange juice remained untouched. The air felt thick, not heavy from tension, but full of a truth too big to fit neatly in words. Emily stood still. Her eyes didn't meet anyone's, but she didn't need to. They saw her now, not just the scars or the stories, but the strength it took to carry both in silence for years. The waitress had become a mirror, and what they saw staring back made many want to be better. Sometimes the universe sends a witness not to add noise, but to make the silence complete. The bell above the diner door jingled. Heads turned slowly. A young man stepped in. Army dress uniform, dust on his boots. He was just passing through, just wanted coffee. But then he saw the room, the eyes, the woman standing still by the counter, scarred but tall, quiet but seen. His training kicked in, he came to attention, and, without a word, raised his right hand, a perfect salute. To a sergeant, to a medic, to a hero in plain clothes. The room didn't clap, but something inside everyone stood up with him. Some moments don't need permission. They just happen when the heart finally catches up to the past. Emily froze. Not in fear, but in a silence that had waited 3 long years. Her eyes met the young soldier's. He held the salute, firm, respectful still, and something in her chest cracked open. Without thinking, without planning, her right hand rose, slowly, precisely. A return salute, crisp, clean, the kind drilled into her bones long before she ever poured coffee. Around the room, eyes blurred, not because they saw ceremony, but because they saw a woman who had finally come home to herself, and for the first time in years, her hand didn't shake. Some memories fade. Others are folded, creased, carried because forgetting them would be unforgivable. David reached slowly into his wallet, pulled out a photo, edges worn, corners soft with time. He unfolded it like something sacred. 12 young faces smiled from the paper, dust on their boots, fire in their eyes. "I've carried this for 17 years, he said. He turned the photo toward her. Every face in this picture made it home, because of you. Emily stared. Her breath caught not from the image but from the weight behind it. The photo wasn't just a memory, it was proof that the pain had meant something, that her hands had saved not just lives but futures. The strongest memories aren't always the loudest. Sometimes they live in a single smile, frozen in time. Emily reached out fingers brushing the photo like she might feel them breathe. Her eyes stopped at one face. A boy, barely 20, grin too big for the helmet on his head. "That's Logan," she whispered. "He used to sneak chocolate from the med kits." A soft chuckle escaped. Said it calmed his nerves. Once gave half his stash to a crying child in Fallujah. She paused. The weight behind her words gentle, but real. "I patched him up twice. He kept saying, 'Doc, I'm fine. You saved the serious cases.'" She traced his image lightly. He got married. Sent me a letter after the war. Said his first kid was named Hope. Around her, the room stayed still, because this wasn't just history now, it was humanity. Recognition doesn't need a stage. Sometimes it just needs a room that finally sees you. The following week, a new sign appeared above the coffee bar, a simple wooden plaque reserved for Sergeant Emily Carter, medic, neighbor, hero. Below it, a framed photo, the same squad David had shown now with Emily's name printed beneath, not hidden. Veterans began stopping by, not to gawk, but to sit, to listen. Chad and his crew showed up again not for breakfast this time, but with a check. $15,000 raised for a local veterans clinic. It's not enough, Chad said, handing it to her with both hands. But it's a start. Emily didn't say much. She just nodded. And for the first time in a long time she sat down not to rest, but to belong. Recognition doesn't need a stage. Sometimes it just needs a room that finally sees you. The following week, a new sign appeared above the coffee bar. A simple wooden plaque reserved for Sergeant Emily Carter, medic, neighbor, hero. Below it, a framed photo, the same squad David had shown now with Emily's name printed beneath, not hidden. Veterans began stopping by, not to gawk, but to sit, to listen. Chad and his crew showed up again not for breakfast this time, but with a check. $15,000 raised for a local veterans clinic. It's not enough, Chad said, handing it to her with both hands. But it's a start. Emily didn't say much. She just nodded. And for the first time in a long time she sat down, not to rest, but to belong. You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. You just have to carry truth when you do. 6 months later, a small-town veterans event sent her an invitation. Emily almost declined. But something inside her whispered, maybe it's time. She stood on a simple stage. No spotlight. Just a wooden podium, a row of folding chairs, and hearts open to hear. I thought my service ended, she began the day they handed me discharge papers. A pause. But I've learned, service isn't tied to a uniform. It's tied to what we do when no one's watching. Her voice didn't rise, but it reached every corner of the room, helping someone fill out a form, pouring coffee with dignity, listening without interrupting. That, too, is service. The audience didn't clap right away. They absorbed, then stood, not out of habit, but out of deep earned respect. Some places never change, but sometimes the way people walk into them does. Emily returned to the diner. Same booths, same creaky floors, same smell of bacon and burnt toast. But now, people didn't just come for breakfast. They came with questions, with stories, with silence needing to be heard. Veterans stopped by just to sit quietly across from her. A high school girl once brought her a notebook asking how to write about courage. A young dad said, "My son asked what a hero looks like." I said, "Come with me, I'll show you." Emily still wore her apron, still poured coffee. But now, every pour felt like a thread stitching a town back together. Not with glory, but with presence. Some thanks arrive late, but never too late. It came in a plain envelope. No return address, just a military postmark. Emily opened it slowly. Inside, one folded page and a single sentence handwritten at the top, "You changed the way I see the world." The letter was from the young soldier, the one who had saluted her without knowing her name. He wrote about how that moment standing in that diner watching her strength shifted something inside him. "I used to think heroes wore armor," he wrote. "Now I know sometimes they wear aprons and carry quiet." Emily smiled. Not wide. Just enough to let something old, something proud settle gently in her chest. Her fingers brushed the paper like it might crumble if touched too hard. She held it close, not to her heart, but just near enough to feel the weight of being seen. Her smile didn't just curl her lips, it softened her spine, like something inside her finally exhaled after years of holding its breath. She folded the letter, tucked it into her apron pocket, and went back to pouring coffee. But this time, her steps were lighter. Some stories don't shout. They whisper their truth and trust you'll carry it forward. The sun was setting through the diner window, spilling gold across the checkered tiles. Emily wiped the counter like she'd done 1,000 times before. But tonight, the letter in her apron pocket felt heavier than paper. It held years and peace. A little girl at a nearby booth tugged her mother's sleeve. "Mama, is she the soldier?" Emily looked up, and for once didn't look away. She just smiled the kind of smile that says, "Yes, but I'm also just someone who stayed." If this story touched you, share it with someone still waiting to be seen, because kindness doesn't vanish, it waits quietly, until someone believes again.